If you could go back and tell yourself any piece of advice to the younger you who started in commercial real estate, what would you tell her?
Be more willing to call out bad behavior. Sometimes sellers do things and either they don't know they're not doing it right, or they think you're never going to find out. Hey, I'm on your team. You have to tell me this stuff up front and be really forthright.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Commercial Connections, Investing with Confidence. I'm Brittny, the producer of the show. Joining us is your host, René Nelson, a CCIM in the Eugene, Oregon area with over 20 years of experience in commercial real estate brokerage. I am so excited about today's episode. I have burning questions that I've been dying to ask René, and we're going to just jump right in.
Hey, Brittny, let's do it.
I'm so excited. I think we've heard from some of our listeners. What I really want to know is, what's the worst piece of advice you've ever gotten in your commercial real estate career?
Oh, it goes all over the gamut. I think more than worst piece of advice, it's more the tales that I've heard from clients where they came into my life and started working with me after they had had certain situations. Like one particular client that comes to mind, he was selling a property in Utah, and they were given, I hadn't met him yet, they were given bad advice, and they missed their window to complete a 1031 tax deferred exchange. So by the time they met my husband and myself, their window had closed and they had to pay the tax. And if I remember right, this was about 10 years ago. I think the tax was like $385,000. Oh, I mean, it was huge. It's really, really hard to make that up in your lifetime, because that's money that you could have deferred by doing a 1031 exchange, but they were given bad advice. And I see that a lot. So one of the questions that I ask people is, do you have a CPA? And if people say, oh, well, I do my own taxes, the first thing I tell them is, okay, you are now playing in the big leagues. You need to have a professional CPA, do your tax returns. I would say 98% of the people do have a CPA. Yeah. So I always advise them, call your CPA, tell your CPA that you're considering selling, find out what your tax consequence is. So there's a formula that a CPA will track on a property, and it's called the basis and depreciation. So depreciation is something that they account for every year. The basis is how you go into the property and how you acquire it. But those formulas all play in when you go to sell. So you need to know your basis, you need to know your depreciation, you need to know what your capital gains would be if you were to sell. So as an example, about 2 years ago, I was considering selling one of my properties, and I just happened to be talking to an appraiser friend of mine, and she said, hey, we might consider buying a building. Would you consider carrying the financing for us? And I've known this group of appraisers for years. I mean, they're all friends, and I trust them. I know they're going to do well, be able to make the payments. And I said, yeah, I would probably do that. Let me check with my CPA. And my CPA came back and said, oh, you don't want to do that. Your tax consequence would be about $185,000 to $190,000 if you started carrying the financing and then they paid you off. Okay. So, $190,000, that's a lot of money in my lifetime that I don't want to have to go back out and try to reinvest and re-earn. And I don't want to have to make up that mistake.
Have you ever seen a seller carry owner financing and it's worked out as a better situation than that?
Well, it's interesting right now because interest rates are a little high. There's some predictions that interest rates are going to drop over the summer, but they're probably not going to go back in the 3.5% range that we've seen over the years. I really feel like where we're at right now is the new kind of base for interest rates. And, right now we're recording this in 2025, interest rates are around 6.5%.
Okay.
So a lot of people think, well, I don't want to put 40 or 50% down like the lender is probably going to require. So I want the seller to carry. But the problem with the seller carrying financing is it still really joins them to the property.
Yeah.
Even though the new buyer takes possession of the property and is responsible for the maintenance and maintaining it and actually operating it, if that buyer defaults, the seller has to take that property back.
Yeah.
And now they've got a tax consequence or a tax issue from a failed sale. If the buyer says, hey, I can't make this property work, I'm just going to give you back the keys, it puts the seller in a bad situation.
Yeah, that sounds super scary. I think like you already own this property. You could 1031 exchange into something else. You could just sell it outright. I mean, I'm sure there are situations when seller owner financing like works out. But that risk of carrying it and then having them default on the payments is that essentially like the seller co-signing the loan with the buyer?
Well, it's not necessarily co-signing, but it's that risk for the seller. So what I recommend to the seller is have legal counsel draft the note that the buyer is going to sign so that there's some teeth in it for enforceability, and it protects the seller as well as the buyer. That way the seller can't just show up on the buyer's doorstep one day and say, hey, I want all my money, I'm calling the note. I mean, it gives provision and protection for both the buyer and the seller to have a good attorney draft the note in the contract so that the terms are really spelled out. But from a seller's standpoint, what could happen is you really need to put in some stop gaps where a buyer couldn't just pay you off in, say, 2 years or 3 years. Because what happens there is if I just push a big pile of money across the table to you in year 2, you now have all of the tax consequence, but you've lost your window to do the exchange.
Oh, that's brutal. And what's the time to do a 1031 exchange?
You have 45 days to identify from when the transaction closes. So you've got 45 days to identify, and then there's additional days to actually complete the transaction, 145. But I try to get mine done in the 45 days because things come up. Often people will identify a total of 3 properties. So if one of the properties doesn't meet the criteria with inspections or if there's issues, we want to move on to the other property pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So I try to get them done start to finish in the first 45 days.
So that's probably some of the worst advice you've heard is, well, that client that came to you and wasn't able to do a 1031 exchange and ended up with a huge tax consequence.
It did create a tax consequence for him. And I just thought, wow, who was giving you advice? And I've heard residential agents give sellers 1031 advice. And I'm always thinking you shouldn't do that. When it comes to commercial real estate, I don't even want to give them advice. I always tell them I'm not a CPA, I'm not an attorney, whatever avenue we're going down where they have questions, I want them to go talk to their trusted professionals. Yeah. I'm a great real estate broker. I'm really good at it. That's what my expertise is. Yeah. But I clearly know when it's above my pay grade. And when it comes to 1031 exchanges, I want them talking to an exchange expert like David Moore, or actually talking to their CPA, learning every strategy that's possible for that exchange.
Yeah. And then the best part about you too is you have such a wide web of networking connections that even though you might not know like the answer right up front, like you know who to call. And I think sometimes that's even more important because you're not trying to be the answers for everyone. You're like, I can admit that I need to ask for help sometimes too. And it's also good to reach out to that network and get all of the advice you can get.
Well, the other thing that I see is, especially if there's siblings that are in a property together, often they'll own it in an LLC, or maybe there's 2 or 3 partners that own a property in an LLC. And one of them may want to drop, they call it drop and swap. So one of them may want to drop out and take their sale proceeds and just walk away with the cash. and not pay any tax. They'll pay tax on it, but they don't want to do a 1031 exchange forward. Either they need the money or they just don't want to own property anymore. And that's something that people need to have a discussion right up front with their CPA and plan that out. You do not want to be sitting at the closing table with the escrow officer having that discussion, because you're past the 8 ball at that point. You're behind. Now you're having to make decisions where things could get missed. And so I always encourage people up front, talk to your exchange facilitator, tell them who all the players are in the partnership. Are you all going forward, or does one person want out? Do two people want out? Because you don't want to make a mistake. It's really, really expensive. And like I keep saying, you can't really make that up. I mean, if you're giving up like $150,000, $190,000, that's really hard if you can't exchange that forward to make that back up.
Yeah, that's a pretty big number. That would definitely scare me if I had to owe that in a tax consequence. I would not be happy, I'll tell you that. I would be really upset.
I've had people who have sold their entire portfolio who were retiring and just sold like a whole portfolio of duplexes, and they knew that they were going to cut a check for $350,000, $400,000, but they knew it. They knew, okay, when April 14th rolls around, I'm cutting a check for this amount. I'm okay with that. I can sleep with that. That's their plan. That's their strategy.
Yes. Okay.
They know, but it's when somebody's setting at the closing table and they're calling their CPA feverishly, that's not a good plan. I don't want to see my clients go through that. So I even kind of like henpeck them. Like, did you call your CPA? Did you call your CPA? I'm sure they're like, gosh, you're
Renee,
worse than a wife. But
Renee, you're like, I'm doing you good.
Yeah. I just feel like it's my job to make sure that they've turned over every stone to know every possibility going forward.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so switching gears, let's talk about creative capital. What are some of the most creative finance strategies you've ever witnessed your clients or others using to gain access into a commercial real estate property?
Probably the best one is using a self-directed IRA to buy real estate. So David Moore is really at IRA Advantage, is really an expert on this, and he's helped me personally do it. So you can use your IRA to go and buy a piece of real estate. Then that piece of real estate will actually create cash flow for you. You don't, like in my situation, because I'm not ready to take minimum distributions that I would have to take in my 70s, that money just goes back to my custodian until all the money is accumulated, or I've decided to sell the property or do something with it. And then I put the property back with the custodian. So self-directed IRAs are really an interesting way that you could use your money rather than putting it in the stock market. You could use a self-directed IRA to buy real estate.
And what's like the least amount of money you need in your self IRA to buy into commercial real estate in 2025?
Honestly, right now, it takes about, my listeners are not going to want to hear this because I want to help everybody. And I eat, sleep, and breathe commercial real estate. I'm passionate about it, but it just takes a lot of money now to get into commercial real estate. And you really need about 400,000 at a minimum, because
to buy in.
Yeah, you're going to need
level.
Well, that's any level.
Okay. Yeah.
It's pretty expensive to buy right now. Yeah, you could buy some smaller stuff like a house or a duplex. But if you're wanting to buy a commercial building where you're going to either have tenants or maybe you're going to move a business in there, it's probably going to be 450, 500,000 at a minimum sales price. So if you go to a lender is going to want 40 to 50% down. That's even if they would give you a loan. So I'll give you an example. Yeah. I have a family that I recently helped buy an older home that has been converted into a commercial building. It's walkable to the University of Oregon, and they're going to put a small grocery store in there that sells like beer and cigarettes and things like that to the kids.
Yeah.
Or to the students. And the
we call them kids.
I know. I know. That sounded terrible. I'm
No.
thinking, I can remember when I was walking on that campus.
They are kids though. Yeah.
The cool thing is, this family has done this for years. And so they've got lots of experience. And so when they went to the lender, which was a local credit union, said, yeah, we'll loan you guys this money because even though you are buying this building, we can see your depth of knowledge and your experience. But had someone else gone in who had never run a convenience store or any type of small business like that, or a bar or a restaurant or anything like that, the credit union, I'm not even sure they would loan to you, or a bank, pick a bank or a credit
Yeah.
union. They
They're
want to
not going
see,
for it.
yeah, they want to see that you've got some experience and some depth of knowledge on what you're doing, because they're taking as much of a risk as you're taking, because they're loaning you their money and they're expecting you to pay it back.
Yeah. And
So they're
money
pretty,
is so tight right now.
yeah, it is.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so crazy. So, yeah, self-directed IRAs. And I've heard you talk about leapfrogging before. Is there a world in where you could buy like a duplex and rent it and then get into something bigger and rent it? How is that possible? And what's the littlest money down you would need to do something like that?
Well, if you're willing to move, you could take an owner. Most people could take an owner occupied loan, even on a duplex. I've seen people go all the way up to a fourplex, but most of the time it's a duplex where somebody would move into it. Depending on, there's certain purchase price caps, but you could do like an FHA loan. And I think you can get in now with like 3% down on an FHA loan. And I think the seller can pay quite a bit of your closing cost. You know, I was a lender, but that was like 20 years ago when I was a lender. It seems like it was yesterday, but it literally was 20 years ago. But even back then, that was how most people leveraged themselves into buying real estate. Was they'd take an owner occupied FHA loan, get into their first house, and then use the equity from that house to go buy another one. So
Okay.
what I see a lot of people do is they'll renovate. So you might buy something below the top of the market, move into it, put 3% down, and go in and fix it up and paint, carpet, put in vinyl, different things like that, and then use that equity to go buy another property and go do another owner occupied loan. You can, technically, you're supposed to only have one owner occupied loan at a time. And I
Okay.
think it's 12 months before they'll give you another one, because they don't obviously want you moving every 2 to 3 months. That doesn't really show that you're really going to live in it. That just shows you're flipping properties, and they're not going to give you an owner occupied loan for that.
Yeah, like that's not what it's for. Yeah, they want to
No.
protect that money for people that are actually leveraging it for the right reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool. I feel like I've seen that advice a couple times online of like
Mhm.
ways to get in. If you saw like a young couple and they have like 50,000 to their name, would you say that what would your be advice to them? Like, do you think it would be smart to just buy a house, up front, or kind of do what we were just talking about where you're sort of like leveraging it against the properties, getting the owner occupied loans? Like, what do you think is going to have a better rate of success? I mean, maybe it depends on what they value, what they want to get out of it, but I don't know. What would you say?
Well, I think it varies a lot, because it depends on how long would they be in the area and in that home. One of my best friends, her kids just moved here from the East Coast, and I bet within 2 years they probably moved somewhere where it's warmer, either like Texas or Arizona or
Hmm.
somewhere like that. Right now they want to be close to their mom, so they're happy living here. But it wouldn't surprise me if they didn't move to a warmer climate. And for their situation, I would not recommend that they buy, because they're not going to see their money come back to them. And really, if you're in a situation where you think you're going to be moving, I would wait to buy, because there's phantom cost with buying a house that nobody ever talks about, especially when you buy a house and you get into it. Then you've got dry rot, there's issues with the plumbing, you've got hot water heater problems. I mean, there's stuff that comes up that you are just not going to see. And
Yeah.
yeah, you can get a home warranty and some of those
Mhm.
other things up front, but there's still phantom costs when you buy a house.
Yeah. I feel like that's pretty scary. And I know a lot of people got homes like during 2020. And then I've been reading some news about the balloon payments that they're facing. Like their mortgages like doubled, almost tripled. I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't even know that could happen. Does that happen in commercial real estate as well?
Well, normally in residential, you get a fixed interest rate where it's fixed for 30 years or 15 years. In commercial, it is typical that they'll amortize a loan over, say, 25 years, but your interest rate is only fixed for 5 years. And then you have a balloon at 10. And the reason that they do that is because the lender wants to be able to reset that interest rate at the end of 5 years, and then they're going to give you another 5 years, depending on how your note is written on your commercial property. They'll give you another 5 years that you can continue to pay at the new interest rate before you have a balloon and you have to pay it off.
Okay, so there's some predictability there, but it comes with like just a faster paced timeline.
Yeah, going in, okay, I've got 5 years at this interest rate before my interest rate is going to change. So it's lenders aren't trying to trick you because they don't want to do that and put you in a bad situation. They do not want property back. They're the opposite. They're really cautious going in to make sure that you're going to be able to make the payments, pay it back, that the loan's secure, the property is going to be well maintained. So they're not going to trick you. They're going to make sure that at the end of 5 years, your interest rate's going to change. Typically, your interest rate goes up. If you see a private owner carry situation like a seller carry, that may be a situation where you see at the end of 5 years that the loan becomes due. That's because most sellers want their money at the end of 5 years.
I remember you said that it's really good for a seller to put provisions in their like owner financing document, because let's say that if they don't put that provision and then the person wants to pay it all in full after 2 years and now it's too late, they can't 1031 into another property. Let's say they didn't put that provision in the owner financing. Why do some buyers want to pay? Why would they pay off in 2 instead of 5?
Well, if interest rates drop, then they would want to go refinance it. And like right now, a seller would want to carry financing at maybe, say, 6%. Well, if interest rates start to drop, somebody would want to go to their bank or credit union and get a 5 year fixed loan and get a cheaper interest rate. They're going to want to pay the seller off.
Okay. Oh, okay. So it's sort of just like another leverage move there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have one last question for you. If you could go back and tell yourself any piece of advice to the younger you who started in commercial real estate, what would you tell her?
I really enjoyed building relationships with my clients. A lot of my clients that I started working with 20 years ago, if they haven't passed away and died on me, I'm still in contact with them. And I've built a lot of long term relationships with people. So going forward, one piece of advice that I would give other commercial brokers is make those long lasting relationships. For my younger self, I would say be more willing to call out bad behavior. Sometimes sellers do things and either they don't know they're not doing it right, or they think you're never going to find out and call out bad behavior and just say, hey, I'm on your team. You have to tell me this stuff up front and be
Yeah.
really forthright. I'm working on a transaction right now that every time I turn around, the seller should have told me something that he wasn't really forthcoming with. And it's making the transaction way harder than it should be. And if he would just be forthright and tell me the information, it would make my job a lot easier. And so being willing to call people out when I was younger would have made my life easier, but I didn't want to upset the apple cart. I was coming into a male dominated industry. I was young in my career. I was a great lender, but coming into commercial real estate, you have to earn your stripes. And so you kind of tiptoe in and you do your business and you start building credibility. And all the brokers in the area are great to work with, but sometimes you just have to call sellers out and say, or buyers, and just say, hey, I'm not going to do that. That's unethical, or, and just kind of put your foot down. And I never did anything unethical. I just was slow to call out bad behavior. And I wished I would have called that out earlier in my life.
Yeah, I 100% know what you mean. I mean, it's pretty scary to speak up when the people who you're looking up to and who you're like training under and partnering with are like the ones doing the bad behavior. And I would like urge people to just remember that it might feel like a shortcut now and that it could like all work out. But I think the troubling thing is that you could hit the pedal to the metal too fast. Like you'll get this deal done, you'll cut the deal, you'll do whatever it takes to get it done. But then it might ruin your career, your reputation, and then no one will want to work with you after that.
That is very true.
Well, That was really, really helpful. I learned a lot. Those are some of the burning questions that have been on my mind since we started the podcast. I'm excited we got to sit down and talk about those. Thank you guys so much for listening. Please like and subscribe. Follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook. We're on Spotify and YouTube at Commercial Connections, Investing with Confidence. And we'll see you on the next one. We have a really special guest coming up for you.